Hello everybody, it's just after 6 p.m, so I'm back again to read from my novel Walking on Cinders, and this is the book. It's 10 years old this year, in May, and so let's carry on now with whatever chapter we're at with this. We are at chapter 29 tonight. Okay, so chapter 29 of Walking on Cinders. The first document of surrender, which encompassed the largest reformed nations, was signed some 2 months after the battles fought amongst the chained Depews, and it meant that the war in Europe, the Middle East, and much of the world was over. As for the other countries, smaller fractions of the reformed government that still remained in island colonies or in the southern hemisphere, their leaders were preparing to sign the declaration within days. Closer to home, Corporal Ewan Roberts, the force's sweetheart Miss Marmalade, and the French twins Belle and René Levette had kept their promise. Days after their visit to the hospital in Clermont-Ferrand, they were at the airport, ready to fly back home to the United Isles of Great Britain and to London, where they had agreed to follow the trial of one Colonel David Smith, much to Ewan's delight. The flight itself passed by without incident, even with the added trepidation felt by two of the passengers, for the last time they had been flying together in a United jet, it had hurtled towards the ground. Life in the capital did not seem so different from when they had left, but then, why should it? There was no welcome party here, nobody to congratulate the brevets of soldiers and those who had made the gravest of sacrifices. They landed at Heathrow, quickly exiting the aircraft and bundling what remained of their belongings into the back of a squat black hovercar, supposedly designed in the same way as a black London cab, before being driven to Central Park Hotel. It was highly recommended by Jennifer, with a staff who was shocked but excited at the arrival of such an impressive party, and the force's sweetheart herself. Here they had been told that the United Army would provide them with a whole wardrobe of new clothes, toiletries and everything that might be needed to gently reintroduce them to reality. Of course, René and Belle Levette were in their element and overjoyed to be in the city that they had longed to visit all of their lives. "It is so beautiful," René had commented as they made their way up to the hotel staircase, where the balustrade and tops of the walls were lined with a beautiful gold leaf. "We simply have to go and see the sights." She was blubbering with excitement, while Ewan and Jennifer's hands were tightly held and they grinned back at her. "Slow down, René," he laughed, happily to finally be back in the city where his memories remained. "We have just returned from the front line where our dearest friend fell, while the leader of our little troop is cooped up in some French military hospital, recovering from rather severe injuries. I don't know about you, but I could do with a rest." Quickly, they made their way to their rooms, Belle and René taking the door on the right, while Ewan and Jennifer used their key card for the one on the left. The fact that the rooms were adjacent to each other meant that they would never be separated for too long. The twins could giggle and gossip for as long as they pleased, while Ewan and Jennifer enjoyed the chance to relax. And that was exactly what they intended to do, for almost as soon as they had crossed the threshold, Ewan collapsed onto the large double bed. "Ah, this is my kind of comfort," he smiled, looking up at Jennifer, who was standing over him. "You don't know how much I've missed a comfortable mattress." "Yes, I do," she teased back at him. "I've been through the exact same hell that you have." Quickly, she leant down and kissed him once on the cheek, before joining him on the opposite side, sliding her hand in behind his back and cuddling up to her very own soldier. Mere minutes later, they were asleep. Standing in the doorway of a tall building, his head concealed by the hood of his jumper, Colonel David Smith looked worried. Normally he would have had no need to don such attire, but today the weather was unseasonably cold and there was a chill in the air which caught you the moment you stepped out of the door. But maybe such bland clothing was befitting of the day's events. Even as he stood and waited, thrusting his hands deeper into the pockets of his scuffed and torn denim jeans, the colonel knew that some low-paid secretary or civil servant would soon arrive to open up the door for him. They would be expecting his arrival, of that he was quite sure. Suddenly the silver touchscreen panel on the wall behind him lit up and the thick glass doors buzzed as they opened inches to the left and right, just enough to allow the colonel to pass through. "Good morning, sir," said a small woman with thick-rimmed spectacles and hair which was drawn tightly into a bun. "If you would follow me." Colonel Smith pulled the hood away from his head and followed the woman down the corridor. Inside, the layout of Lennon's Bank was far classier than the colonel had ever imagined. Of course, He had known for a long time that the company was no longer admitting the general public, and indeed the bank's commitment to privacy and the air of security that had been one of the main reasons that he had chosen it. Outside, you wouldn't think this was a bank at all. The plain brick exterior had black tinted windows and a single glass double door secured through an intercom. But here, on the second floor of the building, and along a corridor that opened up into a large atrium filled with various desks and computer workstations, were framed photos of the past CEOs and large vaults which secured themselves with thick metal doors. "Wow," David Smith whispered to himself as he followed the small woman towards a row of doors at the very back of the atrium. "This is surreal." They passed through the very heart of the company's operation. It was like one gigantic call centre with voices talking at all the same time in a number of European languages. The sound was so intense that the colonel didn't notice the woman stop and direct him towards a door which was slightly ajar. "The meeting will be in here, sir," she said. Her voice was level and unwavering, as if she had repeated this process 100 times already that day. "You will find that your associates are already waiting." Slowly, the colonel reached for the door handle and entered the room, pulling it shut behind him. Suddenly, all the noise from outside disappeared. "Ah, David," rasped a long and low English voice, with the slightest hint of a Chinese accent. "We are so glad that you could make it." Slowly, the colonel's eyes moved across the 3 other faces present in the room. At the head of a table, he recognised his personal banker, a large man with thinning hair and a small grey moustache, while beside him sat the colonel's French counterpart and informant, Commandant Babineau. Finally, and closest to him, the colonel's gaze fell on the man who had spoken first, with thick black hair tied back in a ponytail and a pair of dark sunglasses perched on his nose. Suddenly David Smith had recollections of the many letters he had received from Major General Sir Adam Dutheil in the intervening weeks. There had been one every 7 days, like clockwork, and even though the letters that the Major General had sent made it quite clear that a united win in the Cinders pews was a certainty, and it was this, along with successive missed payments, that made the colonel very nervous indeed. "Sit down, David." This time it was the familiar voice of his banker that spoke, and obediently he drew the nearest chair towards the table and sat down. "Now, before you say anything, I guarantee you will receive your missed payments." The sigh of relief was almost audible. "That is good news," David Smith said thankfully. His personal banker smiled. "Well, you've been a great help to us, David." "Yes," the man with the ponytail continued, cutting the banker off mid-sentence. "I mean, how were you to know that the soldiers you deployed to the Cinders pews would survive such a horrific crash and then walk many miles through fields and woodland to the nearest military base without any kind of direction?" The man's tone was horribly sarcastic. "They're still alive!" Colonel Smith felt sick just asking the question, even though he was already sure of the answer. The man's smile faded as he reached forwards to place a small scrap of paper in front of the colonel. On it was the bottom half of a photo, which showed a large tank and several dead bodies scattered all around. "Yes, they are," he replied seriously. "Well, all but one survived the harshest of battles this war has ever seen. The private, he was killed in action on the final day of fighting, but the corporal and the staff sergeant are alive, as are the females who were with them." Colonel Smith was about to ask for more details, but something convinced him that this would be a bad idea, so he remained silent, choosing instead to focus on Commando Babineau, who until now had contributed nothing to the conversation. For a minute there was silence, each of the other men focusing upon the colonel himself, as if they wished him to respond. "So when will I receive my money?" he asked, having run through every other available topic in his head, while at the same time trying to draw the conversation away from his own mistakes. All at once the room was filled with harsh laughter. When it died down, not only did David Smith realise that the banker was pointing directly at him, but he could swear somewhere in the distance he could hear the faint drone of a siren, a sound almost unheard of in London these days. "David, David, David," his banker replied, breaking out into fits of laughter. "I've promised you that you'll receive your money, but whether you'll be around to see it or not, that's another question." "The war in Europe is over," the man with the ponytail continued, turning to face the colonel directly. "The reformed troops were forced into a harsh retreat. They've lost all hope." This time the laughter stopped, as Colonel David Smith tried to hide from the eyes that were looking right at him. He was unable to do so, and again he heard the siren, louder this time and mixed with the faint ringing of a telephone. Soon the second sound was so loud it drowned out the siren altogether, and for the first time David Smith heard Commando Babineau speak as he lifted the receiver, nodded, and placed it back in the holder. "Very good," he smiled, nodding to his counterparts. "It seems there's someone outside for you, David. They're saying they are ready to take you away." Silently, the man with the ponytail stood up from the table and took the colonel by the arm, pulling him to the door. As they passed through the atrium, everyone fell silent. The atmosphere was almost eerie. And through a large glass window, which he had not noticed before, David Smith saw a series of police cars draw up to the front of the building, blue lights flashing and sirens wailing. He began to sweat profusely. "Why does these things always happen when you are out shopping?" Renée Levette cried as she watched her friends disappearing around the nearest corner. They had been in the middle of some well-deserved therapeutic relaxation, as Jennifer called it, when Ewan had spotted the police cars speeding past them at the end of Oxford Street. Suddenly he had to run to get a better view, and had been just in time to catch a glimpse of the cars disappearing down Regent Street. "We've got to follow them," he shouted back to a flustered Jennifer. "But why, Ewan?" she cooed, struggling to catch up with the soldier, various bags hanging off each arm. "Because..." This time he turned to face the force's sweetheart and placed his hands on either side of her face, smiling. "You never hear sirens like that in London anymore. Think about it. Something serious must be going on." For a moment Jennifer froze and didn't think about it. Even in the many years she had spent living in the city, she could never recall having heard sirens like she had done when she was a child. "You're right," she flushed suddenly, turning to face Belle, who was slowly walking towards them. Rennie made no effort to move at all, turning away to look in another shop window. "Belle," Jennifer whispered as the young girl arrived at her side, "we've got to trust Ewan and follow those police cars. He thinks something serious is happening." The French girl looked a little confused, as if she too wondered what was going on. One moment shopping and the next chasing after a procession of police cars. But she was as willing as ever to go along with whatever she was suggesting. "Come on, Jennifer," Ewan called from the front. "This road leads down to the Thames, and if we head to the tube, we should be able to reach the action before anything else kicks off." Jennifer and Belle nodded in bewilderment, and then, with one last look and a wave in the direction of the remaining twin, they disappeared around the corner, leaving Renée with no choice but to follow them in disarray, hurling her bags all around as she struggled to keep up. On Victoria Embankment, traffic was beginning to back up as the road was closed off. The cordon was patrolled by a series of burly policemen, with while two of their colleagues entered the headquarters of Lennon's Bank plc and headed towards the second floor. Ewan, Jennifer, Renée and Belle had joined the London Underground via Oxford Circus and came up just inside the cordon at Embankment Station. Upon reaching ground level once again, they were immediately confronted by a tall policeman with a very large personality. "Excuse me," he boomed, blocking Ewan's path forwards. "Where do you think you're going?" "Well," the soldier began, assessing the options, "we were hoping to get to the Millennium Bridge." Even as he spoke, Ewan Roberts was already reaching into his back pocket to remove his army ID, while the policeman looked on disapprovingly. Quickly he flashed a card before the officer's eyes, just as Jennifer cleared the top few steps and exited out onto the embankment. "Miss Marmalade!" The policeman's voice rose several octaves as he shouted and pointed in Jennifer's general direction. She was surprised, having purposely dressed down in the hope that people would not recognise her. This man must be a real fan. "Hello," she said sheepishly, looking him up and down. The man didn't even wait for her to breathe. "Are you back from France, then?" "I guess so, yes," was her response, and it gave just enough time for Ewan and the twins to duck past them and get closer to the action. From here they had a perfect view out of a doorway, and where they were able to see two other policemen heading out towards the street, a convict handcuffed between them. But it was only then that things got really interesting. Rennie and Belle Levette felt the excitement and danger running through their blood as Corporal Ewan Roberts moved just a few steps forwards, and the policeman who had until now been distracted by Jennifer suddenly turned around and lunged towards them. "What do you think you're doing?" he shouted, knocking Ewan to the ground as the other policeman and the figure under arrest passed through the doorway and out onto the street. "Jennifer!" the soldier shouted as loud as he could, his voice muffled by the body of the policeman. That's Colonel Smith!" There was so much surprise in his voice that even the policeman who was pinning him over dropped his guard for a moment. "Hold on," he said gruffly, standing up, dusting himself down and pulling Ewan up to stand beside him. "Do you know this man?" Yeah, the soldier replied nervously. He's my commanding officer and he's deployed us all to France. Whoa, the policeman said again, taking a step back, and then slowly he reached down to his belt and removed the radio. I'm afraid you're going to have to come with me to the station, he continued, pointing to each of them individually. Even if you can't give us any further evidence, it'll be safer for you in the long run, especially if you know anything about this man. He took one further step back, but this time he pointed towards a parked police car. Man, he added quickly, you lot shouldn't even be here. Slowly, Ewan looked around again for Colonel Smith and was not surprised to find him seated in the back of the closest police car. Come on, guys, he said with regret. We had better do as the officer says. And that was how Ewan, Jennifer and the twins found themselves spending the night at the headquarters of the Metropolitan Police. They answered questions, detailed their side of the story, and generally played ball until the early hours of the morning. Not once were they told any further information about the case. Not once was the fate of Colonel Smith revealed. In fact, the only piece of information that could be drawn from the night's adventures was that within days, Colonel David Smith would be standing in one of the biggest war trials ever to be carried out in the city. Corporal Ewan Roberts couldn't help wondering if Major General Sir Adam Dutale had planned it all along. So that's chapter 29 of my novel Walking on Cinders. We have a few more chapters to go. It's chapter 30 tomorrow, and I'll be back here to read for you at 6 o'clock, so I do hope that you can join me then. It'd be great to have your company.